So, imagine you're watching the evening news
Okay.
and you see a story about a commercial oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz quietly changing its navigation beacon.
Right. Happens all the time.
Exactly. Then, maybe the next day, there's a quick blurb about a railway bridge exploding, like way up near the Turkmenistan border.
Just another localized incident, right?
That's what you'd think. And then, thousands of miles away, you hear that a former commander with ties to al-Qaeda is reportedly having these back-channel talks with U.S. operatives.
It sounds like completely unrelated chaos.
But it's not. That's the crazy part. These aren't random, isolated events. They're actually all connected. They are like the gears of this massive, terrifying new blueprint for global economic warfare.
Yeah.
We're looking at a geopolitical chessboard where, frankly, the traditional rules of engagement have just been incinerated. And the flow of the world's energy, the stuff that keeps everything running, is hanging by an absolute thread.
It really is. I mean, the whole paradigm of linear conflict, where two armies just meet on a battlefield and shoot at each other until someone signs a treaty that is entirely obsolete here.
Right.
What we're actually witnessing in real time is the weaponization of geography itself. It's the weaponization of logistics, of global supply chains.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really intense live broadcast transcript. It features analysis from some heavy-hitting geopolitical commentators.
We've got Mario Nawfal, a strategist named Brandon, and Stefano.
Right, Stefano, who is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer. And we are going to use their insights to really deconstruct this highly unorthodox military exchange going on right now between the U.S. and Iran.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. We're going to look at this sort of economic hostage situation unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz, and then we're going to trace how all of this is triggering a completely bizarre, map-altering subplot over in Syria.
But before we really get into the weeds of the analysis, we do need to establish a very firm boundary regarding this source material.
Yes, very important.
The text we are unpacking today is, well, it's heavily saturated with politically charged actions. There is volatile rhetoric, highly sensitive military intelligence, specifically stuff involving the Trump administration, the upper echelons of the Iranian regime, and the new Syrian leadership.
It's a minefield.
Exactly. So our role in this deep dive is to take absolutely no signs.
We are operating purely as analytical lenses here.
Purely. We are not endorsing any of the geopolitical viewpoints presented in the sources. We are not validating, the morality or the legality of these military actions.
Right.
And we're certainly not supporting the political statements contained in these intelligence reports. Our sole objective, our only goal, is to impartially report and deconstruct the strategic theories and factual events as the text presents them. We just want to map out the underlying dynamics so you can understand the mechanics of this conflict.
Because, look, if you are sitting there wondering what an Iranian traffic separation scheme or a blown-up railway bridge in the Middle East actually means for your daily life, well, just look at your heating bill next month.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at the price of, literal groceries the next time you go to the store. The moment a geopolitical toll booth gets set up on a massive global maritime choke point, the premium on every single barrel of oil hits your wallet instantaneously.
Instantly. It's the global economic engine under extreme duress.
So let's unpack this, because the physical manifestations of that duress are starting to pop up in some really unexpected places. Let's start with the U.S. strategy.
Right. The new wave of strikes under President Trump.
Yeah. The geographical scope of this bombing campaign has widened way beyond the usual, coastal military outposts.
The target map is fascinating. The commentators in our source material are looking at strikes on coastal targets near Bushehr. They're looking at maritime infrastructure down at the Chabahar port.
Which makes sense for a naval conflict, right?
Right. But then, critically, they are hitting targets far to the north, way inland, up near the Turkmenistan border.
The railway bridges.
Exactly. They are specifically targeting the Belt and Road railway bridges.
And see, looking at that map, if you are dropping ordnance on railway bridges deep inland near Turkmenistan, that tells me this isn't just a traditional, coastal defense suppression thing.
No, not at all.
You don't bomb a train track thousands of miles away from the water to stop a speedboat. This looks like a methodical, deliberate strangulation of their entire supply chain.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like someone trying to put out a roaring fire, but instead of spraying water on the flames, they are just sealing the room and cutting off the oxygen supply.
And the logistics data from the intelligence reports fully supports that assessment. The analysts note that Iran, even when they were under extreme international pressure, they were maintaining a baseline of energy
And
production.
we're still pumping oil.
They were, because the vulnerability wasn't the extraction of the energy, it was the distribution.
Right. If you can't sell it, it doesn't matter if you pump it.
Exactly. So what Iran was doing, they were quietly moving resources out via that northern railway corridor into Turkmenistan.
Yeah.
And they were using Russian-controlled maritime shipping routes in the Caspian Sea.
To basically just bypass the blockades in the south completely.
Yes. So by systematically targeting that Belt and Road railway infrastructure, the U.S. is trying to physically dismantle the arteries of Iranian economic survival.
Wow.
They're trying to collapse Iran's ability to monetize their energy sector by just taking away the physical means of delivery.
But tracing the logic of that oxygen cutting strategy, it leads to a huge question about what the actual end game is here. Because if you trap someone in a room and cut off their air, they don't usually just quietly fall asleep.
No, they panic.
Right, they start thrashing violently to break a window. And the transcript mentions this prevailing theory that Trump is trying to use an escalate to de-escalate strategy.
Yeah, that phrase gets thrown around a lot.
But based on the sources, taking out major inland logistics hubs, that feels like an escalation that is going to force Iran to break the window, not force them to sit politely at a negotiating table.
And the intelligence analysts in the broadcast are profoundly skeptical of that escalate to de-escalate narrative working in this specific theater.
Why is that?
Well, to explain why, one of the commentators actually brings up Herman Kahn.
Oh, the nuclear warfare theorist from the 60s.
That's the one. He coined this concept of an insensate war.
Insensate, like senseless.
Essentially, yes. Kahn used it to describe a conflict that just fundamentally loses its original strategic rationale.
Okay, walk me through that.
So once a certain kinetic threshold is crossed, once the bombs really start falling, the conflict takes on a life of its own. It becomes driven by retaliatory momentum and just raw operational necessity, rather than some grand, calculated political master plan.
So it stops being a control game of chess and transforms into like a chaotic bar brawl where everyone forgets why they started throwing punches in the first place.
Precisely. The conflict just feeds entirely on its own kinetic energy. And crucially, the architects of the war find themselves completely unable to engineer an easy off-ramp.
They can't stop it even if they want to.
Exactly. The commentators argue that the current U.S. Iran dynamic strongly mirrors this insensate model. The military intelligence term they use in the transcript is OBBE.
OBBE, what's that?
Overcome by events. The underlying argument is that U.S. decision-makers aren't proactively shaping this masterful, perfectly calculated escalation ladder. They're being aggressively dictated to by rapidly shifting realities on the ground. They're reacting to events, not controlling them.
And the sources back that up with a very specific mechanical failure from earlier in this conflict, right? Project Freedom.
Yes, Project Freedom is a perfect example.
The way the transcript lays it out is fascinating. The U.S. military realized they were just burning through their advanced munitions stockpiles at a completely unsustainable rate.
Missiles are expensive.
Super expensive. So their proposed solution was to launch a counter-blockade, to squeeze Iran economically without having to rely on dropping continuous million-dollar airstrikes.
Right.
But it fell apart. And it completely fell apart on the logistics table, not the battlefield.
The anatomy of that failure is incredibly revealing, because a counterblockade is a massively labor-intensive naval operation.
You can't just park one boat and call it a blockade.
Exactly. You need a constant rotating presence of destroyers, frigates, massive logistical support ships. And their job is to intercept, physically board, and redirect commercial traffic over thousands of square miles of open ocean.
Which is a logistical nightmare.
It is. And the sources point out two fatal practicalities that killed the project. First, the U.S. simply did not commit the sheer tonnage of naval assets required to make the net tight enough.
They just didn't bring enough boats.
Right. And second, and this is highly significant, Saudi Arabia denied the U.S. the use of its airspace for the operation.
Wait, really? That airspace denial is a massive piece of the puzzle.
It's huge.
Because if Riyadh closes its airspace to U.S. operations, they are effectively blinding the U.S. military in that theater.
Absolutely blinding them.
You lose the ability to easily fly your AWACS surveillance planes to coordinate where the ships are going. You lose your aerial refueling routes for your fighter patrols. You basically create a massive logistical dead zone right in the middle of your operational map.
And according to the text, that forced a massive rupture in Washington-Riyadh relations.
I'd bet it did.
But the broader strategic takeaway that the analysts draw from Project Freedom is this. When the administration paused operations after the counter-blockade failed, that was not some masterful deployment of escalate to de-escalate.
It wasn't a choice.
Exactly. It was a pause forced by physical limitations. They lacked the ships. They lacked the airspace. They were literally overcome by events.
Which brings us to the other side of this equation. Because when a global superpower is trying to choke off your logistical oxygen and actively bombing your railways and ports, the textbook expectation is that you launch a massive, immediate kinetic retaliation.
You'd expect them to throw everything they have.
Right. But looking at the target map of Iran's actual response, it's profoundly asymmetrical.
Very calculated.
They are launching drones and ballistic missiles at U.S. installations, sure. Specifically, the sources mention bases in Kuwait, in Jordan, and in Bahrain.
Bahrain being crucial because it houses the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters.
Exactly. But the analysts point out that what is missing from Iran's target list is actually way more important than what is on it.
Yes. The intelligence assessment heavily emphasizes the untouched targets, specifically the Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates and the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia.
And those are just small outposts.
No, these are sprawling, critical nodes of U.S. air power in the region. They are literally the launch pads for the very drones, fighters, and refueling tankers that are projecting U.S. power into Iranian airspace.
So think about this from the perspective of a domestic Iranian audience. You are taking these heavy infrastructure hits from the U.S. Things are blowing up in your country, and your leadership responds, but they purposely don't throw a massive counterpunch at the biggest U.S. bases located right next door. That must look incredibly weak at home.
It's a huge domestic political risk.
So if the regime is willing to take that domestic risk and look weak, there has to be a really cold, calculated, strategic reason for holding their fire.
And the sources propose two interwoven theories for why they are doing this.
Okay, let's hear them.
The first involves very high-level backroom diplomacy. There is deep speculation in the intelligence community that Tehran is engaged in quiet, advanced negotiations with both the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Really? While all this is going on?
Yes. The theory is that the Gulf states are communicating a very clear boundary to Iran, basically saying, look, we're denying the U.S. the use of our airspace for offensive strikes against you. Therefore, you must keep our sovereign territory out of your retaliatory targeting matrix.
A localized non-aggression pact.
Exactly. And the UAE in particular is highly sensitive to the optics of conflict.
Well, yeah, Dubai relies entirely on foreign investment and tourism.
Precisely. Their whole economic model relies on projecting this aura of total security and stability to international investors. The analysts note that even the activation of early warning sirens in the UAE could trigger massive capital flight.
Just the sirens.
Just the sirens. So the Gulf states handicap the U.S. operational map, and in exchange, Iran keeps the war away from Dubai and Riyadh.
That makes a lot of sense. But the second theory, the transcript floats, seems to go much deeper into Iran's actual military reality, like the idea that they aren't going gloves off because they literally can't afford to.
Yes, the military intelligence cited in the text regarding Iran's missile arsenal is crucial here.
What's the state of their arsenal?
Well, according to a CNN report the commentators reference, previous U.S. strike packages have severely degraded Iran's industrial capacity to manufacture new ballistic missiles.
Oh, wow, so they can't make more.
They are estimated to retain roughly 70 to 80% of their existing stockpile.
Which is still a lot of missiles.
It is still a formidable arsenal, absolutely. But the vital constraint is that it is now a finite resource. Once a missile leaves the silo, it cannot be replaced in the current industrial environment.
And I assume they can't just, hop on the phone and order a fresh batch of ballistic missiles from Moscow or Beijing to restock the shelves.
You'd think so. But the former intelligence officer in the broadcast explicitly addresses that misconception. Missile architecture is not universally plug-and-play.
What do you mean?
You can't just acquire a Russian ballistic system, drop it into Iran, and seamlessly integrate it into indigenous Iranian command and control network.
Ah, right, different tech.
Completely different. You can't just adapt it to their specific launcher configurations overnight. The software integration, the telemetry systems, the crew training required, it's a massive logistical hurdle.
It's not like swapping a USB cable.
Exactly. Therefore, Iran is forced into a position of strict arsenal conservation. They are actively keeping their most capable munitions in reserve.
So they are willingly absorbing tactical losses today because they are playing a much longer game.
Yes.
Their primary weapon isn't actually the ballistic missile sitting in the silo. The primary weapon is time.
Time and strategic patience.
Right. They are utilizing that patience to secure the actual center of gravity in this entire conflict. Which brings us to the ultimate prize, the physical control of the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait is the absolute focal point of the strategic theories debated in this transcript. Every single kinetic strike, every diplomatic back channel, every instance of military restraint we just talked about.
Yeah.
It is fundamentally tethered to the outcome in this one specific body of water.
And the Iranian strategy detailed by these analysts is brilliant in a deeply terrifying way.
It really is.
Because they aren't trying to close the strait entirely, right? That would just trigger a massive global military coalition against them. Everyone needs that oil.
If they shut it down, the world unites against them.
Right. So instead, they are trying to physically herd all the commercial shipping traffic into a very specific lane, the Iranian Traffic Separation Scheme. The TSS.
In the northern route.
Yes, which runs through the northern part of the strait. Break down the geography of that for us.
To conceptualize this, you have to understand that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a free-for-all open ocean. It's relatively narrow, and it relies on designated shipping lanes to manage the massive volume of supertankers passing through.
Like lanes on a highway.
Exactly like a highway. Historically, there's a southern route, which leans toward Omani waters, and the northern route, the TSS, which leans toward Iran.
Okay.
The intelligence analysts outline a campaign where Iran is deliberately introducing chaos, uncertainty, and kinetic threat into that southern route.
Making it dangerous.
Yes. They are massively increasing the risk premium for commercial shipping companies operating in the south.
So if you are like a massive maritime insurance syndicate in London or a shipping CEO sitting in Athens, you are looking at the southern route and seeing a very high probability of your tanker being harassed, boarded, or literally struck by a drone.
You're terrified of the south route.
Right. And right at that moment of maximum panic, Iran points to the northern route, their TSS, and essentially guarantees safe, protected passage.
Safe harbor.
Exactly. They are intentionally creating the danger in the south to create the demand for the north.
And that migration of traffic to the northern route, that triggers a massive shift in international maritime law, which is the entire core of their strategy.
Here is where it gets really crazy.
Because the northern TSS passes directly between two Iranian-controlled islands. And under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, navigating between those specific islands places the vessels squarely within Iranian territorial waters.
Which strips them of international protection.
It strips them of the broader protections of international waters, yes.
That is the trap closing. The moment global shipping normalizes, utilizing Iranian territorial waters for daily transit, Iran establishes the legal precedent to monetize it.
Precisely the fear highlighted by the analysts. Once that northern route becomes the quote-unquote new normal, Iran can start imposing sovereign regulations.
Like what?
They can mandate exorbitant tolls. They can require commercial vessels to hire Iranian maritime pilots to navigate the channel and charge massive pilotage fees for it.
Oh, wow.
The expert in the transcript explicitly compares this end state to Iran effectively owning a geopolitical equivalent of the Suez Canal.
That's wild.
They would be extracting economic rent from a massive percentage of the entire global energy supply.
So they're basically building a geopolitical toll booth.
Yes.
They don't need to engage in some symmetric World War II-style naval war with the U.S. They just need to generate enough ambient fear in the southern lanes that the global market voluntarily routes through their toll booth just to ensure their cargo arrives.
And that explains the entire U.S. counter-strategy right there.
Right, because the U.S. cannot allow that toll booth to be built.
No. Which is exactly why they are specifically targeting maritime infrastructure, like that tower at the Chabahar port we mentioned earlier.
Ah.
They're trying to physically deny Iran the radar, the command and control architecture, everything they need to enforce and manage that northern TSS.
It's a massive, violent contest over the enforcement of international maritime law and freedom of navigation.
That's exactly what it is. The U.S. is attempting to shatter the infrastructure required for Iran to project sovereign control over a global choke point.
Which really transitions us from talking about military tactics directly into talking about an economic war of attrition.
Yes, the ticking clock.
Because if Iran's goal is simply to outlast the U.S. and establish this new maritime reality, the timeline becomes everything. And the sources present a highly counterintuitive argument here. They say that time is actually on Iran's side, not America's.
Which goes against everything we naturally assume, right? We inherently assume that the global superpower, with the exponentially larger GDP and the massive military apparatus, holds the advantage in a protracted standoff.
Yeah, you'd think the U.S. could just wait them out forever.
But the analysts in the text completely invert that assumption.
How so?
They point to things like the depletion of the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they look at the intense domestic pressure that volatile energy prices place on a U.S. administration.
Gas prices dictate elections.
Exactly. The longer the Strait of Hormuz is contested, the higher insurance premiums skyrocket, and the more inflation bites into the U.S. economy. The U.S. operates on an electoral clock heavily influenced by domestic economic comfort.
While Iran operates on a completely different metric of success.
Entirely different.
Think about it. For the U.S., victory requires achieving this massive, complex end state. They have to keep the strait fully open, ensure the free flow of global commerce, and militarily contain Iranian regional influence.
A very high bar for success.
But for the regime in Tehran, the threshold for victory is incredibly low.
The threshold is mere survival. One of the commentators presents a really stark calculus. He says the U.S. military could systematically dismantle 30, 40, or even 50% of Iran's industrial, economic, and military infrastructure.
Just level the country.
They could level ports, sever railways, degrade all their air defenses. But if, when the dust finally settles, the current regime remains in power in Tehran, if they maintain domestic control and state continuity, they will internally classify that outcome as a strategic victory.
Wow.
They do not need to win the war, they simply need to not lose the state.
They can absorb catastrophic physical damage because their political structure is literally designed to withstand isolation.
Right.
But there is a massive economic variable in this waiting game that the transcript highlights, and that's the U.S. decision to remove sanction waivers.
Yes.
Because if Iran's entire strategy is to just sit in the bunker, take the hits, and wait for the U.S. domestic political will to collapse, pulling the sanction waivers feels like flooding the bunker.
It does. In fact, the revocation of sanction waivers is analyzed in the text as potentially the most devastating weapon deployed in this entire theater.
Really?
More than the bombs?
Carrying far more long-term lethality than the kinetic strikes on the railways, yes. The expert delves into the intricate psychology of international corporate finance to explain the mechanism of this damage.
Okay, because it's not just about what is legal to do today, right? It's about the perceived risk of what might be illegal tomorrow.
Exactly. Multinational energy conglomerates, European banks, massive global logistics firms, they operate on timelines of decades.
Right, they aren't looking at next quarter, they are looking at 2040.
Yes. They require highly predictable, stable environments to commit billions of dollars in capital expenditure. So when the U.S. Treasury Department demonstrates its willingness to abruptly revoke sanction waivers, it completely shatters that predictability.
It shows them the rug can be pulled at any second.
It proves to the global market that the U.S. possesses a unilateral kill switch for international investment in Iran. So let's play that out. Even if the U.S. and Iran sign a comprehensive ceasefire tomorrow and Washington officially lifts every single sanction, the chilling effect remains.
The fear is still there.
Because if I'm a CEO in Tokyo or Berlin, I'm looking at the Iranian market and realizing that, hey, 2 years from now, a new administration in Washington could just flip that switch back on. Instantly freezing my assets, blocking my access to the U.S. financial system, stranding my investments. The perceived risk of returning to the Iranian market becomes mathematically unjustifiable no matter what the diplomats sign on paper.
Which means that even if Iran successfully waits out the military conflict, even if they secure the survival of the regime, they are inheriting a permanently suffocated economy.
They win, but they get a broken prize.
Right. The sanctions waiver precedent ensures that they remain locked out of the global financial architecture for a very, very long time. And that adds an immense existential pressure to their strategy of strategic patience.
So we basically have two immovable strategies just grinding against each other. The U.S. is trying to physically dismantle Iran's logistics and permanently lock them out of the global economy.
Right.
And Iran is absorbing the kinetic punishment, hoarding their high-end missiles, and just incrementally trying to seize legal control over the Strait of Hormuz.
A total stalemate.
And because neither side can achieve a decisive, clean victory, the conflict has mutated into this bizarre, violent routine that the sources call the new normal.
And the commentators express profound alarm at the normalization of this violence.
It's crazy.
We are seeing discussions of memorandums of understanding and active, ongoing diplomatic negotiations occurring simultaneously with daily kinetic military strikes.
Like, a port is bombed on Monday, a drone hits a U.S. base on Tuesday, and the diplomatic teams politely meet for coffee on Wednesday.
Exactly. It fundamentally breaks the historical mold of conflict resolution. The intelligence officer in the transcript specifically contrasts this current environment with the 1991 Gulf War, or the immediate aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
How was it different back then?
In those eras, when a diplomatic off-ramp was being navigated, the kinetic operations paused.
Right, a ceasefire meant a ceasefire.
The guns went silent to allow the diplomats actual room to maneuver. But today, we have transitioned into an era where military violence is no longer the breakdown of communication, it is the primary medium of communication.
The strikes are carefully calibrated messages.
Yes, both Washington and Tehran are completely comfortable using low-level kinetic action as literal leverage at the negotiating table.
Wow.
The profound danger, as highlighted by the analysts, is the sheer hubris required to believe this new normal is indefinitely sustainable without a catastrophic miscalculation.
And to fully grasp just how razor-thin the margin for that miscalculation is, we have to look at the actual physics of the weapons being utilized to communicate.
The hardware matters.
It does. The source text goes out of its way to differentiate between the types of munitions flying through the airspace over the Gulf right now. Because Iran is leaning really heavily on low-flying cruise missiles and drones for these routine strikes, the U.S. defensive posture is somewhat manageable.
The operational realities dictate that defensive response. Let's break it down. A cruise missile, or a loitering munition, a suicide drone, operates essentially as an unmanned, explosive-laden aircraft.
It flies like a plane.
Right. It relies on aerodynamic lift, it flies relatively slowly, and it hugs the terrain to evade long-range radar detection. Because of that flight profile, it remains vulnerable to a wide spectrum of countermeasures.
Meaning we can shoot them down pretty easily?
Relatively, yes. Fighter aircraft can intercept them, and they are highly susceptible to short-range air defense or SHARED systems.
Like what?
Like ground troops utilizing shoulder-fired Stinger missiles or mobile Avenger air defense systems. They could effectively engage and destroy them. We've seen this operational reality proven in contemporary conflicts like Ukraine every single day.
But the moment we see a shift toward their ballistic stockpile, the entire defensive calculus changes instantly. Because you cannot shoot down a ballistic missile with a Stinger. It's a completely different physics problem.
Completely different. Yeah. A ballistic missile exits the atmospheric constraints of aerodynamic flight. It launches vertically, ascends into the stratosphere, exosphere, and then relies on gravity to pull it back down toward the target at hypersonic velocity.
It's coming straight down from space.
Exactly. SHARED systems and fighter jets are entirely useless against a threat plunging from the edge of space at Mach 5 or higher.
Which forces the U.S. to rely exclusively on highly advanced, incredibly expensive point defense systems, things like Patriot batteries or the THAAD system.
Yes.
And the vulnerability here, which the analyst points out, is in the definition of the phrase point defense. These systems do not throw an invisible, impenetrable shield over an entire country.
No, they don't provide a blanket umbrella. They project a highly localized, specialized interception envelope, essentially. A mathematical box drawn around a very critical asset, such as a major airbase or a key command center.
Just a small box.
Right. If the trajectory of an incoming ballistic missile determines that its impact point is going to be outside of that specific box, maybe it's aiming for a civilian population center a few miles away, or a less critical piece of infrastructure, the point defense system will often conserve its expensive interceptors and literally just allow the munition to strike.
It just watches it hit. That reality completely shatters the illusion of total security. If you are operating outside of those very specific, predefined Patriot bubbles, you are entirely exposed to the ballistic threat.
Completely exposed.
Which makes the stakes of these daily routine drone launches astronomically high. One miscalculated trajectory or one decision by Iran to utilize a ballistic asset instead of a cruise missile against an unprotected target, and this new normal instantly spirals into a full-blown regional war.
The margin for error is zero.
Exactly. Which actually brings me to a fascinating moment in the transcript regarding the fog of war and how political rhetoric just muddies the waters even more.
Oh, the Trump quote.
Yes. The commentators bring up a statement from President Trump where he claimed, like, quote, 111 missiles were shot by the Islamic Republic of Japan.
Which is a lot to unpack.
Right. I mean, beyond the obvious geographical gaffe of confusing Iran and Japan, the core of the statement, the assertion that 111 anti-ship missiles were simultaneously launched at a U.S. aircraft carrier, is heavily scrutinized by the intelligence professionals in the source material.
They immediately dismiss it as practically impossible within the current operational environment.
Why is that? I mean, couldn't they launch that many?
Well, launching 111 highly sophisticated coordinated anti-ship missiles at a single carrier strike group isn't a skirmish, it's a massive saturation attack.
Right.
It's designed to overwhelm the Aegis combat system.
Right.
It would represent a level of escalation and coordinated command and control that would be physically impossible to hide from satellite intelligence.
We would see them prepping it.
We would see it. And more importantly, an attack of that magnitude would trigger a massive, undeniable kinetic response from the carrier group that simply hasn't occurred.
We would have noticed if World War III started.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates the intense informational chaos surrounding the conflict. You have the stark, unforgiving technical realities of Patriot point defense envelopes and ballistic trajectories on the ground, layered beneath a thick fog of political hyperbole, grandstanding, and misinformation swirling at the highest levels of leadership.
It's terrifying. And while this high-tech informational and kinetic standoff threatens to boil over in the Persian Gulf, the source material pivots to a completely different yet deeply interconnected geopolitical earthquake happening further west.
In Syria.
Yes, because if Iran's maritime logistics are being squeezed in the Gulf by the U.S. Navy, it makes their overland logistical routes infinitely more valuable.
They need a backup plan.
But right as they desperately need that overland fallback, the ground in Syria is violently shifting beneath their feet, introducing an incredibly unlikely cast of characters.
The transcript details a profound strategic pivot centered around the Syrian president, al-Shura.
Al-Shura.
Yes, and the intelligence assessment immediately flags his background, which is vital context. Al-Shura is a former commander for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS,
Which is?
a militant organization with deep historical and ideological linkages to al-Qaeda.
That is a staggering resume for a sitting head of state.
It really is.
But what the intelligence analyst focuses on isn't actually his extremist past. It's his current geopolitical maneuvering. Because al-Shura is actively severing the land bridge from Iran to Hezbollah.
Yes.
Let's mechanically break down why that specific action is causing a seismic shift across the entire Middle East. Because it's huge.
It changes everything. For decades, the cornerstone of Iranian grand strategy, their main mechanism for projecting power in the region, has been the maintenance of a contiguous overland logistical corridor.
And the land bridge.
The land bridge. This corridor originates in Tehran, pushes westward through Iranian-aligned political and militia structures in Iraq, crosses the border into Syria, and terminates in Lebanon.
Okay.
This bridge is the physical artery through which the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force funnels advanced weaponry, financial resources, and personnel to their most potent proxy force, Hezbollah.
Right, and the intel officer in the transcript references King Abdullah of Jordan, who years ago warned about this exact logistical network. He called it the creation of a Shia crescent dominating the region.
A very famous phrase.
And now al-Shura, utilizing his control over key Syrian territory, has essentially taken a sledgehammer to the center of that crescent.
By taking control of the key transit nodes and border crossings within Syria, al-Shura has physically interdicted that supply chain.
Right.
He has denied Iran their primary secure logistical lifeline to the Mediterranean and to Hezbollah.
Wow.
This represents a catastrophic strategic degradation for Tehran.
They are getting cut off.
Yes. And the geopolitical paradox here is that this action aligns seamlessly with the core strategic objectives of the United States.
Which leads to the most jarring diplomatic development analyzed in the text. There are credible reports circulating that because al-Shura is successfully bleeding Iranian logistics, the Trump administration is considering removing Syria from the state sponsor of terrorism list.
It's realpolitik at its most extreme.
Let's just process the reality of that. A former al-Qaeda-linked militant commander takes over a state. And because he happens to sever the supply lines of America's primary adversary, the U.S. might reward him by wiping his state's terror designation completely clean.
It is the absolute distillation of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, applied at the highest nation-state level.
It's wild.
The analyst argues that from the perspective of Washington, the ideological purity of the Syrian leadership is totally secondary to the strategic utility they provide.
If he's useful, they don't care about his past.
Exactly. If al-Shara demonstrates the capability and the willingness to act as an impermeable bulwark against Iranian regional expansion, and if he is willing to nominally reincorporate Syria into the international diplomatic framework, the U.S. is prepared to overwrite his history.
The sources even note that U.S. Central Command is already engaged in open, active cooperation with al-Shara's government under the umbrella of quote-unquote counterterrorism partnerships.
Right.
But the expert analysis makes it abundantly clear that this is not a clean, stabilized alliance. The reality on the ground in Syria is a chaotic, fragmented nightmare, and al-Shara does not possess an absolute monopoly on violence within his own borders.
Not even close. The intelligence officer deconstructs the severe internal vulnerabilities facing the al-Shara government.
What's happening internally?
Well, the transcript discusses alarming reports of horrific massacres targeting the Alawite minority.
The Alawites, that's the ethno-religious group associated with the former Assad regime, right?
Yes, concentrated mostly in the coastal mountainous regions. And the analytical debate within the sources centers on command and control. Did al-Shara directly order these massacres as a brutal, sectarian purge to consolidate power? Or were they perpetrated by heavily armed, undisciplined rogue factions within his coalition who are seeking historical revenge?
And the intelligence consensus in the text points toward the latter.
Right, it does.
Because his military apparatus is not a professionalized, centralized, uniform-wearing army. It's a messy coalition of disparate militias.
Exactly. When the leadership in Damascus signals a desire for a harsh crackdown, that vague directive translates on the ground into localized warlords committing severe atrocities outside of any centralized command structure.
And managing those rogue elements is just the baseline of his problems, because the map of Syria is literally carved up by massive, heavily armed ethnopolitical groups that just flat out refuse to submit to his authority.
The sources specifically map out the friction zones.
Where are the biggest issues?
In the northeast, you have the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which are spearheaded by Kurdish fighters.
Right, the U.S. allies.
Yes. They have established significant territorial autonomy, they control crucial energy resources, and they have historically relied on direct U.S. military backing. Integrating them into a centralized, Arab-dominated government run by a former Islamist commander is a monumental challenge.
They aren't just going to hand over the keys.
No. And similarly, in the southern Sweda province, the Druze population is reportedly fiercely resisting full incorporation into al-Shara's central state apparatus. They're demanding to maintain their local autonomy and self-defense capabilities.
So Syria isn't really a country right now. It's a fragile patchwork of heavily armed fiefdoms.
Exactly.
And the U.S. is looking at this map and seeing the ghost of a massive foreign policy failure. The transcript explicitly references the fear of Libya 2.0.
A very potent fear in Washington.
Explain the Libya comparison for us.
In Libya, the decapitation of the central authoritarian regime created a vast power vacuum. That vacuum was immediately filled by competing tribal militias, warlords, and foreign mercenaries. It fractured the state into chaotic warring zones and exported massive instability across North Africa and the Mediterranean.
It was a disaster.
The U.S. diplomatic and military establishment is terrified of Syria following that exact trajectory.
Because a fractured, chaotic Syria, a state without a strong central authority to police its own borders, is the perfect breeding ground for Iran to just slip right back in.
Yes.
They could infiltrate, reestablish their proxy networks, and rebuild the very land bridge that al-Shara just severed.
Exactly. Therefore, the U.S. is aggressively pushing al-Shara to consolidate power, absorb the SDF, pacify the Druze, and build a unified functional central government, regardless of his past.
It's all about logistics, and to demonstrate exactly how radically the traditional alliances in the Middle East are being reformatted by this logistical war, the intelligence officer points to the massive recalculation occurring within Israel right now.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. Given the binary choice between, on one hand, a fractured, chaotic Syria that allows Iran to rebuild its proxy networks right on the Golan Heights.
A nightmare for Israel.
Right. Or, on the other hand, a stabilized, centralized Syrian government led by al-Shara that actively suppresses Hezbollah's supply lines. The Israeli security establishment may quietly prefer the stability and utility of the al-Shara government.
Think about that. A government led by a former HTS commander might be viewed as the safer bet for Israeli national security.
It's unthinkable. But that single fact illuminates everything about how desperate and fluid the geopolitical environment has become. Permanent interests have completely superseded ideological history.
The entire architecture of Middle Eastern geopolitics is being violently remodeled in real time, and it is dictated entirely by the brutal necessities of logistics, economic survival, and supply chain dominance.
Wow. Okay, let's pull the lens back and view the entire chessboard we've analyzed today, because the connective tissue here is staggering.
It really is when you look at it all at once.
Yeah. In the Persian Gulf, we see the United States utilizing overwhelming kinetic force to surgically dismantle the logistical arteries of the Iranian state, hitting the Belt and Road railways, hitting the ports, while at the same time deploying the devastating economic weapon of sanction waivers to terrify global capital and suffocate their future.
A dual-pronged attack.
Yes. Conversely, Iran is absorbing that punishment, refusing to deploy their finite ballistic arsenal and executing a campaign of strategic patience. Their singular focus is establishing sovereign, legal dominance over the maritime choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, attempting to force the global economy to pay a toll for its energy survival.
The geopolitical toll booth.
Right. And the shockwaves of that standoff in the Gulf are actively redrawing the map of the Levant. Because Iran's maritime logistics are under siege, their overland routes became critical. And precisely at that moment, an unlikely former extremist commander in Syria seizes power, shatters the Iranian land bridge, and suddenly finds himself aligning with the strategic interests of the U.S. and potentially Israel, all while struggling to prevent his country from dissolving into a localized warlord state.
Every single thread is connected by the flow of resources. The localized conflicts are merely symptoms of a massive, interconnected global struggle for logistical supremacy.
Which brings us back to the reality of how this actually impacts you, the listener. The traditional metrics of war, armies taking territory and raising flags, they're gone.
They belong in the 20th century.
We are living in an era where a severed dirt road between Syria and Lebanon, or a commercial tanker changing its route through a specific lane in the Persian Gulf, that has the immediate, tangible power to dictate the inflation rate in your hometown and alter the global economic trajectory.
The vulnerability of the global supply chain is the new battlefield.
It is. Which leaves us with a final, chilling question to consider. We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing Iran's attempt to build a geopolitical toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz. But what if their strategy of strategic patience actually works?
What if they win the waiting game?
Exactly. If a nation can successfully hold a critical global economic choke point hostage, not by achieving total military victory, but simply by generating enough ambient fear to alter commercial routing, and by outlasting the domestic political patience of a superpower, what is the global precedent?
It changes the playbook forever.
It does. If this blueprint is validated in the Persian Gulf, what is stopping other rising powers or well-armed rogue actors from looking at a map of the world, identifying their own vital straits, canals, or transit routes, and deploying this exact same strategy of economic hostage-taking in the decades to come?